Well, for what it's worth, I'm going to make another video here. It's been some time. Some people have asked me, why haven't I made a video in so long? And quite frankly, I've kind of lost the impetus for doing them simply because YouTube itself, it's not about you. It's, well, YouTube is so commercialized at this point that, and, it's not as if anybody cares what ordinary people have to say. If you look at the favorites and the big channels on YouTube, that basically tells you all you need to know. It's the commercialization of something that started out as a pretty good thing, but since Google took it over, what can I say? I'm not even going to get into this. I wanted to basically convey my standpoint regarding this whole situation in the Ukraine and with Russia. And this whole confrontational stance, which is happening in Western Europe and America versus Russia, and all this rhetoric. And it's not just Cold War rhetoric. It's actually much worse now than what it used to be. So my considered opinion is, and I'm not a stranger to reading things about American foreign policy. I've been interested in this for a very long time, namely, very intensely interested in it for about 20 years. So I'm not a newcomer to the subject. I should probably tell my audience that I was born in Western Europe. And so I'm very familiar with the post-war history of Europe after World War II. And so this whole situation, which is going on now in the Ukraine, is a geopolitical game, which is being played between, basically, it's being instigated by the United States of America in order to retain some dominance over what we call the Eurasian continent. Okay? So you can read up on all of this in Brzezinski's book. And Brzezinski, incidentally, in case you didn't know this, Brzezinski, of course, was the national security advisor to the Carter administration back in the day. And this was, before the fall of the Berlin Wall or any of that. This was when there still was a Soviet Union. And Brzezinski's idea at the time was that we should arm the basically fundamentalist Islamist, the Mujahideen, in Afghanistan and Pakistan in order to defeat or wear down, more or less, the Soviet Union militarily. And so he instigated a program by basically arming and funding the Mujahideen in Pakistan and in Afghanistan during the war in Afghanistan, in which the Russians were involved and the Americans were trying to push back. So this whole, this whole ISIS thing, everything had its start there, essentially. So now we're looking at 40 years later, and we see these policies in action. And the basically the the blowback from all these policies, and the blowback, incidentally, also concerns ISIS. But I'd have to make another video about ISIS itself because it's a rather complicated situation. ISIS itself is essentially funded by several Gulf nations, and at times the national interests of the United States converge with their interests, and at other times not. So ISIS didn't just arise out of nowhere. But let's drop the ISIS stuff for now. Maybe if people are interested, I'll make another video about it. The problem in Ukraine is that it is essentially a nation which is landlocked, which has natural resources of its own. It has an industrial sector in the eastern part, and it has in the middle part you have a very uh, how should I say this? It's a very fertile region for growing crops and so on, and you have a sort of westernized part uh, on the western end of it, in other words, Kiev. Now, uh, basically, Ukraine has always been used, the nation or the landmass and its people of Ukraine have always been involved in the geopolitical conflicts between other powers. So to call it a completely independent nation is a farce to start with. The entire Russian um, the Russia itself actually originated, if you look back at history, Russia itself originated essentially in the Ukraine, in Kiev, as a matter of fact. So it has a very, very long history if you go back hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, of course, the situation changed dramatically during World War II. And the western part was taken over essentially by the Nazi powers, and there were many collaborators on the western part. And you shouldn't just, you have to look at it from a human perspective, because sometimes these ordinary people over there, they just, wanted to keep out of harm's way. So you tend to collaborate with the invading forces, and because you don't want to get your head knocked off. And so this is how it's a very complicated human situation there. Now, the problem is that after the fall of the Soviet Union and its demise, the Yeltsin government ushered in, and it actually started with Gorbachev, and the Yeltsin government allowed essentially unfettered capitalism, a sort of robber baron capitalism, to take over Russia, the remains of it as a whole. This was a very terrible time for Russian citizens, because there was many people were pushed into abject poverty in Russia because of that. There were so many crooks that rose up, including Khodorkovsky, I might add, one of the Russian dissidents, who is now celebrated in the West as a somehow human rights icon. And nothing could be further from the truth. Essentially, the guy took advantage of the situation in Russia and eventually formed the bank. He was part of the Soviet system to start with. Okay, so during all these grabs, all this chaos in Russia, during the disintegration of the Soviet Union, he was essentially an opportunist, and he robbed the Russian population blind by essentially promising all the stuff, putting out all these little coupons for the Russian people, then cashing in on those, eventually taking control of Yukos, the oil company, and trying to essentially sell that off to Western investors for, a couple of bucks, so to speak, in terms of what it was really worth. And so this is how these Russian oligarchs came into power in Russia. And it should be noted that Putin was he was also placed into power by the Yeltsin insider circle. But it becomes pretty complicated from there, because Putin realized that this neoliberal economic system in Russia would only benefit the West, for one thing. So the entire nation was supposed to be sold off, at huge profits for outsiders. But for ordinary Russians, there probably wasn't too much left. And so he gradually started to put a halt on that. And he had his own oligarchs that he promoted in order to further his ideas. There's no question of that. So it's not as if Putin is not, as if there isn't any corruption going on in the Putin government as well. There is. But Putin realized that this fundamental idea that the market will solve all human problems, he did not agree with that. And that put him at odds with some of the market fundamentalists in the West. And incidentally, these market fundamentalists in the West, dating back, to Milton Friedman and the Chicago School and so on, they are also taking over the entire West. So this is this neoliberal model, which says that, governments are really useless. Really, the market can set all values, including social values, social safety nets, and so on. But as it's turning out, this is becoming a problem because this neoliberal model has been pushed further and further and further during the last 30 years. During the last 30 years, we have seen the rise of inequality all over the globe rise, not fall. We have now essentially 0.1% of enormously wealthy people and individuals controlling 60% of the world's wealth. So the inequality, according to this market fundamentalism, is actually, it is not being diminished, it is rising. And on a global scale, and exponentially so. And so while I'm not a Putin supporter, you might say, I'm also not a Putin antagonist, because I think the man is smart enough to see what is going on. The last thing anybody wants is the type of social inequality which will bring about a violent revolution in a country. And once people are pushed far enough, that is precisely what will happen. And so Putin put the brakes on and he said, nope, we're going to distance ourselves from an unequal relationship here. We're going to make our own policies. We want to have a country in which we can have free markets, but not unfettered free markets. And we should preserve our social safety nets. Not everything should be dictated by the market. And most of the Russians, having had this introduction to market capitalism, they're okay with it, which is why Putin is very popular in his own country. But at the same time, he's putting on the brakes of putting on the brakes when it comes to this winner takes all mentality. He's saying, the really funny part about all this is that Putin is actually promoting the kind of social democracy which used to exist in Western Europe, but which is now being actively dismantled by these market fundamentalist and neoliberal economic forces in Europe. You may not know this, but I have connections in Western Germany, or Germany as a whole. And you would not believe the amount of poverty which is increasing all across Western Europe, with labor rights being curtailed, with all these new free trade agreements, including a very malicious agreement called TIP, which essentially gives the right to corporations to sue governments because it might infringe on their profits and so on. So it's a very complicated story, but I want to get to the point here. There is something that needs to be said about the expansion of NATO across Europe and now reaching to essentially the Russian border. Now, this did not happen by accident. You can read any kind of foreign policy journal, American Foreign Policy Journal, and this was essentially planned. This did not happen by accident. While the rhetoric out there for average American citizens, if they listen to their mainstream news and it said, well, Russia is the aggressor, in my opinion, Russia is not the aggressor here. It is very clear that the expansion of NATO has completely changed the map of Europe. And while the Warsaw Pact, which was a military pact, dissolved and disintegrated, the same was not the case for NATO. And you have to remember, even though in the public mind, NATO is a largely European institution. It's called like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right? It has absolutely nothing to do with the North Atlantic anymore when it is being projected into the Southern Caucasus. So what it is an economic/military alliance, an economic model that is being let's say, projected via military power. And if you read about the history of NATO, ostensibly this was a military alliance against the Soviet Union. But as it now stands, there is no longer a Soviet Union, of course, but for some reason, NATO did not disintegrate. Now, you may want to ask yourself why that is. Why NATO continued to exist despite that there was no more Soviet threat. Well, the reason why it still exists is because of this economic model, which was supposed to be pushed eastwards. And so you back that up by military power. And NATO, if you look at it, is essentially controlled by the United States of America. The spokespeople appearing in the media for NATO are mostly Europeans. They come from, Denmark, from other European countries. But the military control, in other words, the command of NATO, is always and has always been under American military control. So this is something for people to think about. Now, this demonization going on in the American media as well as the Western German media has completely gotten out of control as far as I'm concerned. Putin is being put out there as some sort of a demon, as the new Hitler, so to speak. And I mean, you can read the headlines in Germany. It is absolutely atrocious, the sort of media bias, Western media bias, which is being projected as some sort of a true standpoint. As somebody who comes from Europe, I can tell you that Western Europe has nothing to gain from a confrontation in Russia. The only entities which have something to gain from this kind of a confrontation is the United States, United States of America and their basically their higher establishments. It would be a terrible thing to go to the brink of a wider war in Europe over the issue of Ukraine. The Ukrainian people, as a matter of fact, don't matter to the Americans. The Ukrainian people are essentially, the entire nation of Ukraine is completely broke. So then the Europeans are supposed to pay for, loans for to bring up Ukraine back into the Western fold or whatever. It's not going to work. The nation is broke. There are going to be more IMF loans. The Ukrainian people will not benefit at all from any of this. And Ukraine should have been used, Ukraine would be better as a bridge between Western Europe and the East, not as a point of confrontation. But it is in the American foreign policy interest to make a mess out of Europe so that it can project its dominance across the globe. And I can tell you one thing. I live in the United States of America, and I am completely against this policy. If we're going to live in a global society, then it needs to be recognized. And Brzezinski is incidentally coming to that conclusion as well in his latest book, Strategic Vision, America and the Global Crisis of Power. He's kind of backtracking now somehow. He's saying, well, we should project our power as long as we can. So let's foment some alliances and association, because the rise of other nations is really in the long term not going to be stopped. But he is such a Russophobe due to his own personal history during his upbringing in Poland. He has such a bias against Russia that he and his policymakers and they have a huge influence on the U.S. Department of State to this day. All you have to do is look at any video over at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Look at those videos and you tell me whether the United States foreign policy establishment is not trying to foment essentially the destabilization of Russia as a political entity. This is very important for Western Europeans and for the most part Americans to understand what is going on in terms of these geopolitical games. And the games are now being ratcheted up in terms of the rhetoric, the demonization of first Putin, then Russia as a whole, and now with this whole incident with this assassination of this opposition leader in Russia. I need to let Western audiences know, and I'm Western myself, okay? I need to let people know that this guy who was murdered in Moscow in front of the Kremlin, how convenient, was not trusted by most of Russian citizens. Yes, there are opposition movements in Russia, but they're also mostly funded through various NGOs, various U.S. State Department projects, just like in the Ukraine. And the object of these games being played is for the undermining of any other opinion, economic model out there that might be worthwhile for other nations. This has nothing to do with other nations. This has nothing to do with nation building. It has to do with the destruction of nations under a neo-economic model. So that's the larger picture. It is my belief that Putin, least of all, would have anything to gain from the assassination of an opposition leader, who is a zero anyway in Russia. And the people who gain from this, or rather the entities that gain from this, are the American foreign policy establishment, which seeks to have some sort of dominance over the Russian state. It is very clear what's going on here. The National Endowment for Democracy is anything but. You should see what the National Endowment of Democracy is doing in South America or in any other nation. It has nothing to do with democracy whatsoever. So that's my video for today. Kind of long, but yeah, see you later.